Morning, everyone who's watching, and thank you for joining us slightly earlier time this morning for our Advice Line live event. My name's Sophia Bukiel. I'm the Senior Community Advisor here at Scottish Autism for our Advice Line. And I have the pleasure of being joined by two members of the team today, Caroline and Samantha. So good morning both, and thank you both for joining me. Today's Advice Line live event is really an opportunity for anyone watching to ask us anything. So please pop your questions in the comments below, and I will try and do my utmost best to keep an eye on these. In the meantime, I guess Caroline, Samantha, we do have a couple of pre-submitted questions. So whilst we wait for anyone watching to pop their questions in the comments below, we'll start to explore some of these questions. Is that all right with the two of you?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah. So our first question is from a parent, and they've spoken about their son's bedroom and described it as a bit of a disaster. And I guess what they're asking is they're wondering how they can support their son to tidy their room, or to at the least dust their room. And I guess when reading this question, we all reflected that actually this is something that we're asked of quite frequently in terms of how can I support my child to tidy their room, or I guess even taking their laundry down the stairs to be washed. And I guess a lot of the time when we were talking about this question is that for us it's about stripping back the whole situation, and I guess starting back at the beginning and almost going back to basics really. And Samantha, I wonder whether you could kind of I guess give some advice around this situation and how you might do that.
I think it's looking at the whole picture, so the whole task, and really breaking it down into the steps involved. And actually, if we're specifically looking at dusting, for example, actually, does that young person actually understand, what's meant by dusting? Does that need to be modelled to them? And actually, do they actually understand and see the value in that dusting? Is that important to them? And perhaps even looking at, the implications, if we don't, in terms of how that could impact on you as an individual. Also, does that individual need prompting, for example? So there are things like task boards and other sort of organisational tools. There's apps and things like that as well, if someone is more of a digital learner. And I think it's just looking at in terms of also communication as well. How are you communicating that task to the young person? Are they viewing that as a pressure or a demand? So I think there's lots of different things that we can kind of unpick and look at here. And I think it's just really, really just looking at, what works best for that young person as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of considering the individual, and how I guess what we would call their autism profile and what that looks like for them, and understanding, I guess, kind of how to support communication or how to support elements of the different parts of tidying a room as well, because actually there's a lot of parts to that kind of process of tidying a room and breaking that down for people. Caroline, is there anything else that's kind of coming to your mind in terms of how you might support this situation?
Yeah, I think sometimes there's a difference in expectations. So an adolescent may have a different expectation of tidying a room compared to what a parent does. And I think sometimes it's about kind of meeting in the middle about what is it that each person needs to know, and what is actually required. And sometimes starting with a kind of meeting halfway by maybe doing something together, but making some and doing just very, very small things, but achievable things that are nice things to do. For example, maybe like putting washing in a washing basket that you're holding, like a parent's holding. So just something that's a bit more kind of joint, and then working, the end result might be eventually for the young person to be as independent in some of the areas. But I think also making things quite obvious, so it's a really obvious cleaning thing as opposed to a subtle thing. And I think some things are a bit subtle, so things like dusting might be quite a subtle thing, whereas something, for example, maybe picking a cup from, I don't know, a worktop or something, is a bit more obvious. So I think but it does have to be very individualised, and I think that's where on the Advice Line, when we have a chat with people over the phone or live chat or by email, that we're able to get a bit more of an in-depth discussion going on about what's best for the individual people within that family and also for the family unit as well. So I think it is quite an individualised thing to get to know what's that young person's communication style, what are they more motivated by, what do they like doing. So it's almost a bit, as you were saying, going back to the basics to go forward in a kind of quicker way as well, but in making things actually achievable, but small and achievable, just very, very small steps, and just making it quite a kind of positive thing. Because what you don't want is an issue to become a clash. You know, that's a kind of, the bedroom stuff is, I think, can often can be a kind of a clash thing. But so I think you just kind of focus in a slightly different way, and I think through discussions that can be quite helpful with families for us anyway. And I think.
Yeah, and I think you spoke about it there in terms of it can cause that clash between families, and I think that's definitely something that we observe through the advice line when this kind of type of question arises, is that it causes quite high levels of stress for everyone within the family, parents, but also the young people and children, and you know, where that clash can really come about. And like you say, it is going back to basics, and I guess kind of those small steps that you mentioned, you know, actually focusing on the small steps of supporting, kind of tidying that room, rather than kind of, I guess, automatically thinking about the end goal and the bigger task within that. And I think you're right, Caroline, actually, in terms of this question, I think it'd be really good for us to have a conversation with the parent who submitted the question. So for if you're watching, we will be in touch with you directly, I guess, to explore that question further and to see how we can give you some real personalised and individualised kind of support around that, in terms of supporting your son to tidy his room, and as what you described, a bit of a disaster. So that the team will be in touch to kind of answer that question. I'm trying to keep an eye on the kind of comments below the video just now, and the live stream, and yeah, just encouraging people to ask any questions that you might have. That's what myself, Samantha and Caroline are here for today. So please pop your comments beneath the live stream, and we will answer those as we go. Another question, both of you, that we received was regarding a 15-year-old son, and the parents are advising that they've been on a waiting list for an assessment for a couple of years now. And for the last kind of roughly 6 to 8 months, their son has really struggled to attend school. And prior to this, had some real difficulties with peers, both in person, but this also moved to online. Their son is kind of telling them that he is sad, feels quite isolated, but as a family, they're really struggling to support their son to make the step out with of the home. And his sleep is also kind of, I guess, disrupted at this moment in time as well. Caroline, I wonder whether, in terms of that inquiry, what your thoughts are, because I guess it's another inquiry that we do receive in terms of, I guess, people being on waiting lists for an extended period of time. And you know, difficulties around attending school and interactions with peers.
Yeah, and I think it's a really kind of common inquiry that we get, and I think once again it sounds quite easy, but actually when you look at it, these situations are usually quite complicated, and often there's not just one wee issue, there's like a number of issues that contribute to the family's distress. And I think once again, through discussions with the family, you know, you might begin to find that actually there are areas that are of slightly more concern, or things that might be what we might discuss as maybe some priorities to consider. So for example, in this situation here, things like sleep are often they're quite common, but also poor sleep affects a whole family. So if you've got a young person or a child that has sleep issues of any sort, then often that's almost a priority to consider, and sometimes to seek maybe professional support for that. And we'll come on to who that would be, like Sleep Action, and we'll kind of discuss that in a wee minute. So I think things like prioritising what might be important to start with, and then you've also got, if you're looking at education, then organisations like Inquire Scotland. So it is about kind of starting to kind of look quite one thing at a time to say, okay, is this a priority and what else is next? And, you know, for children's kind of well-being, you've got Salvation and Mind Room. So I think it is about identifying the young person's needs, the parental needs, what do the family need, and kind of starting with the kind of going back to the basics and looking at what might be a kind of priority. But, you know, and I think looking at each thing kind of logically as well. And Samantha may have some other information as well regarding this inquiry.
And I think sorry, Samantha, I guess what I was going to say there is in terms of what you're describing there, Caroline, I guess, you know, and how we kind of speak about these types of inquiries sometimes is it's almost a ball of string, and which thread do you pull in terms of the child's needs, but also the family's needs, and I guess which area do you focus on first, which I guess is going to have the most support and benefit for everyone, I guess, involved. And there are lots of, like you say, lots of different supports out there. And Samantha, I think you were going to come in there and obviously start to explore some of those supports. So what are the supports out there for families?
If we're looking at sleep, for example, as Caroline mentioned, there's Sleep Action. There's also something called the Teen Sleep Hub. So I think those, in terms of sleep, would provide a really good starting point. In terms of the education element, Caroline had touched upon Inquire, which can be a really good resource. There's also, in terms of advocacy, there's an organisation called Salvation and Mind Room, which can be really, really helpful as well. And really, for that young person, you know, they've mentioned that they've not had the best sort of peer connections with others, and it's maybe actually creating some new connections. So there's the National Autistic Society have a group called Empower Up, which is for 12 to 19-year-olds. That's online as well. And, you know, in terms of an individual's needs, if someone is maybe not so comfortable in that space, they can turn their camera on and off, they can use the chat function, you know, so it can be really well adapted. And if, for example, as a family, we have also ourselves, Scottish Autism, have Click and Connect groups. So, you know, there's like an art group and there's other groups as well that they may want to explore as well. So there's a few different options that they can look at there, which might prove helpful.
There's a whole host of options out there. And I guess, you know, me reflecting on this question in terms of, you know, the 15-year-old son, and I guess the kind of complexities within that situation, the different, I guess, areas of need within that I think actually in terms of that type of, I guess, question probably sits quite nicely with our Get Set for Autism program of support as well. So for those watching, Get Set for Autism is support for parents and carers whose children are under the age of 18, and it's wherever wherever a family may find themselves on their journey. So we can offer pre-assessment support, but also post-assessment support once the child has received a diagnosis of autism. And that program of support is really for, I guess, supporting parents and carers to kind of have a greater understanding of autism generally overall. But also, I guess, linking you up with the relevant professionals, agencies and organisations that can kind of offer that support in those different areas of need, shall we say. And I guess the advisors through that programme of support will also then support you as parents and carers to, I guess, explore strategies and ways in which you can support your child moving forwards. And it's extremely personalised, and I'm sure Caroline, Samantha, with the families that you have kind of personally supported, it is extremely personalized, isn't it? And I guess there's lots of different areas that you focus on with families. I guess giving everyone a bit of an example who's watching, what are the areas that you tend to focus on through Get Set?
So for some people, they're looking at helping their child to understand emotions, for example. It may be, for example, that it's a new diagnosis, for example, or they're in the process of being on that assessment pathway. So, you know, they're thinking about, you know, how do I explain that to my child so then they have a greater understanding of their own identity. Sometimes, you know, we get some individuals who are, you know, want to look at strategies for sleep or for sort of managing routines and sort of just making their sort of day-to-day routines calmer and things like that, looking at things like the low arousal approach. So it really varies, and it's very personalised to the family. So, you know, each family we work with will look very different and their needs can vary.
And I think for some families, I know myself and Caroline were reflecting, was actually there's been a few families that we've supported through Get Set for Autism around those kind of difficulties in terms of peer interactions. And, you know, specifically, I guess bullying is something that we have supported families through as well. And, you know, how families can be supported maybe by schools if it's happening within the school environment, or what they should be considering if it's out with of the school environment. So yeah, when reading this question, I guess the feeling for me was that actually it's probably an ideal kind of scenario, or unfortunately that actually it's for Get Set for Autism, and we can provide that longer term support through 4 to 6 sessions with an advisor. So yeah, I guess I would encourage that person to get in touch, or for us to make contact as well, to see if that type of support would be helpful. I'm just trying to keep an eye on the thread of conversation that's happening under the comments just now. Again, I would encourage people to kind of get in touch if you have any questions. But we'll continue to go through our kind of pre-submitted questions, because we have had a few, which is quite nice. So the next question is regarding a daughter who is 20 years old, and since leaving school has been really successful academically and really thriving academically. But I guess what parents are reflecting on is that they have, I guess, no real peer support network in terms of support. And I guess what they were asking was, what social opportunities are available to her? Caroline, what social opportunities are available?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of potential there, and so I think once again we need to look at the individual. We know there's things that might be out there, for example, specifically for women, like there's Swan. So they have lots of things going on, so that might be of interest to that particular person. But equally, that particular person might have interests that they like to do, or hobbies that they like to do, or things like that. And I think sometimes using those as a basis, you know, to search out what might be there locally or online. So looking at it from not just a social aspect, but from an interest, to make the social things a bit kind of round the houses a wee bit. And sometimes that's a more comfortable way, because then the focus is on the interest, and then social things tend to come along with that. So that's one idea. There's also, as Samantha has said earlier on, you've got the Embrace Autism. So you've got a whole number of potentials within that. You've got some online social groups like Click and Connect by Scottish Autism. So there's lots of things that are potentially there. And I think what we also do if we're speaking to a family is often really, really helpful to know, where do you live? Where does the person live? Because sometimes there are some groups that are actually only localised. So sometimes, so maybe like Glasgow groups might only be for people in Glasgow or something like that. So it's really good for us when we're having a discussion with a family is to say, well, where are you? Can we look at what's locally available for the young person, and sometimes for the family as well, to see what social opportunities may be there as well. But once again, it's kind of very individualized as well, about what does that person want? What do they like? What's their motivations? So that I think it's very much kind of individualized. I think regarding that.
I think it is extremely individualized, and like you say, Caroline, actually looking at an individual's interests is really important part of that in terms of forming social connections with others. So I think, you know, in terms of those situations, like you say, it's really helpful to know where people are, what their interests are, and just, I guess, having a conversation more broadly around, I guess, what type of social support is it that they're looking for, what peer support are they looking for? So again, it's one of those kind of questions that we tend to encourage people to have a conversation with us about, in terms of, let's explore that a bit further, let's find out what their interests are, let's find out what local opportunities might be available, and really understand what that individual's needs are in that moment in time. And I guess sometimes, you know, actually is the individual looking for that peer support as well? Are they looking for those connections, or actually would that be too much at this moment in time, especially if, you know, we're speaking about this individual who's being very successful academically? Is that their focus just now? So yeah, we encourage that conversation, and I guess that's what the advice line is there for. what I'm going to do is move on to our kind of final pre-submitted question, and it might well be our last question of the day. At the moment, we're not getting any kind of live questions through. So our final kind of pre-submitted question for today was again from a parent regarding their child who describes their child at times, I guess, being non-speaking and experiencing kind of situational mutism. And in their question, they were saying that those trying to offer and provide support to their child has kind of withdrawn their support, almost calling this non-engagement. And the parent was really kind of getting in touch with themselves because they feel at a bit of a loss, really, in terms of what they do next. As I guess what they're hearing from their child is that they're actively asking for help and support. So I guess what do they do in this situation? Samantha, what are your thoughts around this? And again, it's an inquiry we do receive quite frequently sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's first and foremost not putting pressure on that child. So, if that child in certain scenarios, isn't feeling comfortable to speak, are they happy to use gestures? And I think it's actually exploring what are their communication preferences as well. Do they prefer writing things down? Do they prefer putting things into a message? And actually just remembering that not all communication is verbal, that there are other forms of communication. So in groups or at appointments or with other agencies, putting across that message and asking those questions, are we able to use the chat function? Is there a hands up function? And just looking at all those sort of adaptations that potentially can be made. Because sometimes when we go into a new situation, that's a transition in itself, and it takes time to sort of build up that communication. And it's not a case that the child's not engaging, it's just that the communication preference of speaking verbally isn't comfortable for them in that environment. And I think, there are other organisations that have like chat functions and things like that, even if aside from working one-to-one with a particular organisation, there's things like Childline has like a one-to-one counsellors chat, if they just wanted to be able to chat with someone. So there are other organisations that, have those sort of chat options. And I think it's, as a parent, asking those questions and, trying to re-engage with, perhaps any services where it's not gone well and looking at how that could be adapted going forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think some of this as well is about, I guess, for I guess spending that time to understand what an individual's communication preferences are. And part of that in terms of developing that understanding is building that relationship and trust. I think trust and relationship is a real key part to this in terms of supporting individuals to feel comfortable in I guess engaging with different services, especially when they're new and they're unknown and it's somebody that they haven't met before. So actually, it is about developing that relationship and actually, dependent on what help and support it is that, the individual might be engaging with, actually, is it spending some time to know what their interests are, what the things are that they enjoy, to build up that relationship first and foremost, and using those communication preferences that individual has. Caroline, what if you, I can see you have maybe some thoughts around this as well.
Yeah, I was when we do a get set, well, one example is when we do a get set, one of the areas that we often look at is communication. And with an example like this one here, and I always think it's really interesting because once you look at communication, you begin to see that actually often the young person or the child is absolutely wanting to communicate, is absolutely listening, is absolutely motivated to participate, but just that there's, for whatever reason, for their distress, there's barriers that are there. But those barriers, the young person often says, well, they're wanting to, and with the right methods, because often they might text their parents as well, or chat to their parents in their own bedroom where they feel nice and safe and chat away. But often they're also absolutely able to communicate in different methods, whether it's kind of looking at live chat or whether it's chatting by email or whatever trendy thing it is or whatever it is. So often, as you were saying, we just need to understand the communication, understand the distress, and look at potential ways forward, because often the young person is absolutely wanting to participate, wanting to be involved. And I think often when maybe they refuse a service, or for whatever reason a service has to cease because of seen as if they're not participating. I think the young person is often quite devastated by that as well. And I think there's always potentially ways in to for that aspect of communication. You know, I think there's quite subtle ways in, and although the speaking thing may be really difficult in many settings, we know that in some settings it is comfortable, and it's, well, what's that about? And you know, and really about understanding that individual as well, and the family situation, what is causing such distress. And often these are long-term situations as well, and I think that's where Get Set is particularly helpful as well, or a call, but Get Set's good because you can kind of get into a kind of longer discussion regarding that individual situation, and what things are positives from that, and what communication aspects, you know, or visuals or whatever it is that suits that individual, that could then be used as possibilities, as opposed to that the child isn't wanting to, but often they absolutely are wanting to be involved and participate. And listen, they're often listening to what's going on as well. So
yeah, definitely. And I think what you're describing there, and there's a saying that comes to mind from another colleague within our kind of team previously, was it's people getting to know people. You know, and that's, as you know, as simple as it can be is just getting to know individuals. And like you say, there's that, you know, for a lot it's there is that drive and want to engage, and that they're listening, but I guess it's understanding what that individual needs and what their preferences are. So again, definitely something that, like you say, we could explore through Get Set, and have those kind of longer term conversations with a parent and carer to really understand kind of how this person can be supported to access different various supports. So no, that's great. Thank you both. And I guess that is the end of our Advice Line Live event today. So Samantha, Caroline, thank you again for joining me this morning. It's definitely been a morning of varied questions, shall we say, in terms of those pre-submitted questions. Our next Advice Line Live event will be in June. Further information about this event will be shared nearer the time, but we hope this morning has been helpful for those watching. And I do, anyone who's joined us live, I do see that there has been a kind of last minute question popped in, but we'll be in touch to kind of see if we can answer that question for you. But in the meantime, the rest of you who are watching, enjoy the rest of your days, and we'll be joining you all live again soon.